All right, afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to give another presentation that focuses on elephants, but in some ways it's kind of going to be the flip side of the talk that we just heard. So we heard a lot about the costs that are associated with the conservation of megafauna, and I want to talk about some of the benefits that might be associated with megafauna conservation, in particular elephants. And the specific context and topic that I'm going to discuss is estimating the economic losses to tourism that's currently being incurred due to poaching of elephants. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Brendan Fisher from Vermont, and Andrea Manica and Andrew Bomford from Cambridge. Marcos, how are we doing for time? Do I need to speed through this?
You have time for minutes.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay, I know I'm between you and lunch, which is always a dangerous position to be in. So, what is the problem we were trying to address here? It's that tens of thousands of African elephants are being poached every year. And this is a photo that I took in the, gracias. This is a photo that I took in the Caprivi Strip of Namibia earlier this year. We were actually looking for live elephants to attach satellite collars to, but just in the course of doing that, we came across a half dozen at least very fresh carcasses. This is becoming more and more common across all of sub-Saharan Africa where elephants are found. And we understand well why it's happening. So we estimate about 600 million US dollars worth of ivory from dead elephants has left the continent of Africa between 2010 and 2012, largely destined for markets in Asia such as China and Vietnam. So the economic motivation for this current wave of poaching that's happening is something that's pretty well understood. But what's less well understood is what are the benefits that we might be losing because of this poaching. So that's what I want to talk about here. And specifically, I'm going to talk about economic benefits. So there are plenty of good reasons that have nothing to do with economics that might motivate our conservation for elephants. But I'm going to particularly here talk about the economic benefits. And I'm going to discuss in the context of elephants, but I want to suggest that both the approach that I'll talk about in particular here and also this more general framework of how to think about the economic benefits that elephants might deliver is applicable to other types of megafauna. So I'd be very interested in hearing from people who work with different species of megafauna in different contexts how something like this might be applied. I don't want you to sort of go into detail on this figure, but what I just want to point out is that species like elephants and other species of megafauna have a whole variety of different economic benefits or values associated with them. And those can be use values, things that we sort of directly use elephants for, the indirect impacts. We've talked about sort of ecosystem engineering of megafauna in earlier talks. We've touched on a lot of these actually in the course of the talks that we've already heard. Some of these things on the left-hand side of the graph in particular tend to be easier to quantify in terms of economics because they're linked to markets. Some of the things on the right-hand side are a lot more difficult to quantify. There are certainly methods associated and that are applicable to all of these different types of value streams that might flow from a species like elephants. I'm going to simply focus on one particular type of benefits, and that's the contribution of elephants to tourism, and see what we can see about trying to quantify the benefits that are associated with that, and in particular, in the context of this current poaching wave, what we might be losing in terms of tourism benefits. So how did we go about doing this? In 2015, we published a paper called Walk on the Wild Side, estimating the global magnitude of visits to protected areas. And what this paper did is, across a whole bunch of different protected areas around the world, used a data set of hundreds of these protected areas and developed a model that essentially predicted the average annual number of visits to these protected areas as a function of a variety of characteristics, including the wealth of the country, how accessible the protected area is, its natural attractiveness, its surrounding human population, and its size. So this produced a relatively good model that was able to predict with some reasonable robustness the average annual visits that a protected area receives. So what we did is took the African component of this data set, expanded, added to it, which turns out to be 164 protected areas across sub-Saharan Africa in areas where elephants, in countries in which elephants occur. And what we did is we modified that model. So I'm going to walk you through what we did here. And the first thing to point out is that the data come from 1997 to 2008. So it's a rough annual average of visits during that time period. That's simply where we were able to find the most data during that time period. And so what we did is we took this model that predicts visits. We kept the same covariates as we did in that previous paper, and we added a variable, and that's elephant abundance or elephant density. And these estimates are estimated with uncertainty, so we accounted for that in a Bayesian modeling procedure that I'm happy to talk about later. I won't get into now. This is what the data set looked like. So we've got sub-Saharan Africa here. The broad elephant distribution is in gray. In green, we've got protected areas where elephants occur. In dark green, areas where we have information on the number of visits. And then finally, in blue, protected areas in countries in which elephants occur, but at that particular protected area, there aren't any elephants, but for which we have tourism data. What we then did was the following. We predicted across all 216 protected areas across Africa where elephants occur, the number of visits during this time period, roughly, which was prior to the very recent release of the latest census on African elephants. This was the most up-to-date information that we had on the numbers of elephants that occurred at these sites. And this led to sort of a baseline prediction of the number of tourists that are visiting these areas. What we then did is rerun the model, but including our best information on what is happening at these protected areas in terms of the poaching rates. We were able to do that because of this paper that was published in 2014 by George Whitmire and colleagues that estimated at these same protected areas for which we had information on elephant numbers, the proportion of illegally killed elephants, or pike as it's known. This can range from less than 1% to almost a third of elephants being killed annually. So this represents our best estimate of what is being lost at these particular protected areas where we also had the other information that I'd mentioned on visits and elephant densities. What that did is then result in a different number of predicted tourists. And in fact, the tourist visits that are being lost because of this reduction in elephant numbers. Now, to come up with an economic estimate of what that reduction in visits implies, we took a variety of different data that looked from studies that have looked at how much tourists spend on particular visits to protected areas, as well as the impact of those dollars spent as it trickles through local economies. We did that by referring to about 50 or 60 studies that have examined in African protected areas the impact of visits to those protected areas. We get a distribution of those spends. We incorporate all of that into the model. So empirically, what did we find? So this is a table of regression results, and I'm just going to direct you to a couple of different points. The first is that as a result, we actually did find that even after we account for all of these other factors which we know affect the number of visitors to a protected area, we found that elephant density had a significant positive impact on visits. So the more elephants you have, the more visits you have, all else equal, even after controlling for these other factors. The second point is that that relationship is not true in the forested protected areas of Africa. So we can see this negative interaction between elephant density and forest. So this positive relationship between elephants and visits is being driven by protected area visits to the savanna or non-forested areas of Africa. And we'll come back to that in a moment and why it's important. I should mention the model was a pretty decent model, predicted about 45% of the variation in tourist visits. So as a result, we estimate that across all African protected areas that contain elephants, the effect of poaching is such that visits are being reduced by about, on an average, 12,500 per year. And so we use our estimates of how much tourists spend on these visits to then come up with an estimate that the economic impact of poaching, as it's currently happening, is about $25 million per year, and with 95% sort of certainty, it's within the $13 to $45 million range, given the data that we have. These impacts are not distributed evenly across Africa, however. So most of these losses are occurring in East and in Southern Africa. By far the majority. That's where tourism is big business, and there's still a lot of elephants left. The losses to tourism from poaching are a lot less in West Africa, where there simply aren't that many elephants, and also especially in Central Africa, where there simply aren't that many visits to protected areas. So these figures were, I think, interesting in and among themselves because they give you sort of an idea of the scale of the economic benefits to tourism that are currently being lost due to poaching. We also wanted to go one step further. Oh, and before I do that, I'm going to mention that these lost benefits can actually be substantial at the level of a country. So for example, in Tanzania, about $500,000 per year to tourism is being lost, which can be about 4 to 10% of gate receipts at parks for entry by tourists. So again, we wanted to go one step further and actually ask, well, how do these benefits that elephants deliver and that are currently being lost, how do those compare to the costs that it would take to stabilize elephant populations? So to sort of make sure that elephant populations, while not necessarily gaining, are not going down either. So surprisingly, there hasn't been that much work that has been recently done on this issue. So we had to rely on older work that estimated that for large elephant populations, to stabilize those populations would cost on average about $565 per square kilometer of funding. This is work from Nigel Leader-Williams. This sort of happened in the first wave of African elephant poaching in the 80s. And you can sort of see how old this work is by the quality of the graph that I scanned in from a PDF of this paper. So what we did is take those costs, our estimates of how much it would cost to stabilize elephant population, and compare them to the benefits. We did that by using this metric called rate of return. So I'm going to show you some bar plots now that plot rate of return on the y-axis. Anything above 0 means that for every dollar that you invest in elephant conservation, you're actually getting more than $1 back. So you've got a positive rate of return. And then if you're below 0, the opposite is true. If you invest $1, you're getting less than $1 back. And then the final point that we wanted to make is that we wanted to compare how those rates of returns for tourism to elephant conservation compares to rates of return in other sectors that governments typically make sort of on a routine basis. So things like education, agriculture, infrastructure, electricity, much more typical routine investments that are made across the countries in which elephants occur. And that's the distribution of those values. So we see that a few of these are actually sort of generate negative rates of return, but by and large, as you would expect, most of them deliver positive rates of return, and you can see where they fall in terms of that return on investment. So how does this compare to what we find for elephant conservation? So that's what the figures look like. So starting on the left-hand side, Central Africa, we can see that very strongly negative in terms of rate of return. So here, from a purely tourism point of view, investing in elephant conservation at current doesn't really make economic sense, or doesn't at all make economic sense. But if we turn our attention to West Africa, and in particular Southern and East Africa, we can actually see that these return on investments, these rates of return, are strongly positive and well within the range, or even at the higher end of the range of investments that governments will routinely make in a variety of different sectors. So, we heard earlier about trying to engage stakeholders, outside of this room, and we all don't need economics to sort of tell us that it's important to conserve African elephants, but we're probably in the minority. A lot of people don't share that viewpoint. So trying to provide this type of information and say, well, in addition to the moral and the aesthetic and the ethical reasons for conserving elephants, here's some evidence that suggests it actually makes good economic sense, and it's well within the range of things that you would ordinarily do, we think can sort of broaden that base of support for conservation. So, to conclude, that what I just said, all that is true in the savanna areas of Africa. We didn't see the same thing in the forest areas. So here we concluded that at least at present, tourism is really not going to be a strong justification for conservation of elephants in the forests of Central Africa. They're, basically visitation rates are quite low in these areas. We're dealing with inaccessible protected areas. And elephants are hard to see in the forest, and we didn't find that strong relationship between visits and elephant density that we saw elsewhere. As I've just said, the story is different in the savanna areas of Africa, and it does make sense from an economic point of view to invest in elephant conservation. This work has just come out a couple of weeks ago, so you can read more about it there. I just want to conclude by sort of trying to bridge to this general idea of megafauna. And in principle, it is possible to do this type of analysis and approach with other types of megafauna because, again, we heard a lot about the costs in the previous presentation, but often these species are also the ones that people really care about for a variety of different reasons. From a tourism point of view, I'm working with some partners to try and see if this approach can be replicated with tigers in India and possibly in other range states. We're also looking at the possibility of doing that for lions as well in other parts of Africa. The caveat to all of this is that there's some pretty heavy data requirements and analytical procedures that need to be done, and there's really no guarantee that the relationship that we found for elephants and tourists will occur for these other species. But again, what we've focused on here is, if we think back to that chart that I showed you in the first slides with all the different types of benefits and value streams that a megafauna species like elephants might have, there's a whole array of techniques from the economic valuation world that can be applied to those types of situations. And I'm hoping over the next few days that we get to discuss some of those for the particular species and geographies that other people work in. I don't know if I have time for questions.